Are the folks at BHVR Interactive bad at making video games? Now, before you instinctively laugh that question off and say something like, obviously, duh, I want you to really consider what I'm asking. When taking into account the studio's entire body of work, is BHVR a good company from a quality standpoint? Hello everybody, I'm DasFood, the YouTuber you shouldn't subscribe to, but will, because you're rebellious, and I like that about you. Today's video comes on the back of a recent announcement that went out from BHVR Interactive, wherein they announced the long-awaited Project T has been cancelled. Now, details about Project T are somewhat limited, but from what I've been able to find, it was going to be a PvE shooter where a cast of original characters battled against monsters known as the Thrall. Early gameplay would lead me to believe that this was almost supposed to be somewhat akin to a third-person Left 4 Dead game, but maybe that's just the aesthetics being kind of similar and it's tricking my brain. I don't know, that's what it looks like to me. Basically, regardless of what it was, it looked pretty cool and I was sad to see that it got canceled. But this has led quite a few people on Twitter to bring up a common point of criticism against BHVR, that being that they don't know how to make good games and got lucky with Dead by Daylight. For those not in the know, I'd like to offer a quick history lesson on DBD. While it's something of a juggernaut in the modern day, that was not always the case. Long before there were figurines, board games, spin-off video games, and a Blumhouse-produced film, Dead by Daylight was a small game from an unproven studio. This was back in the days when the game was owned by Starbreeze, who were notoriously strict with what could and couldn't be in the game. A good example of this would be that Starbreeze had a hard rule that BHVR could never add a clown to the game. So, suck it on that one. Getting back on track, DBD was a little game that could in its early days. It was a profoundly interesting idea that tapped into a previously unseen market. Creating a game that simulated the typical slasher film experience was a great idea, and the team at BHVR did a fantastic job coming up with worthwhile lore to hold their game together. Even better was that the core cat and mouse gameplay was lots of fun. In many ways, it delivered on the promise left unfulfilled by one of gaming's most notorious flops of the era, Evolve. Dead by Daylight found a really solid recipe for asymmetrical multiplayer and ran with it. From there, I feel like most of you are familiar with the story. DBD grew organically for a while, and then they added the Halloween chapter, which is dated now, but hit like a bump of booger sugar back in the day. And then they just kind of kept on repeating that process. Release original content for a while, drop a spicy hot licensed chapter, quadruple the player base, rinse and repeat. It didn't even matter that most of the early licensed chapters were pretty mid to bad. People were just so hyped to play as Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, and Leatherface in a video game that actually suited them. Horror cameos had been strangely out of place in the past when it comes to video games, like how Mortal Kombat X had Leatherface fighting a bunch of Kung Fu masters, or how Call of Duty had Michael Myers killing a bunch of soldiers with an axe for some reason. But with DBD, these characters were finally home. Not only that, they were calling all their friends too. It became a massively popular pastime to speculate on which licenses would join the game next. After all, this is being billed as the Smash Bros of horror, as a museum of horror, so everybody's in eventually, right? That hype cycle has carried DBD, and in turn, BHVR, for most of this game's life. It doesn't matter that most of the metas have been boring, or that the content drops seem to miss just as often as they hit. As long as the player base is still frothing at the mouth for the Pee-Pee Poo-Poo Man chapter, the devs have us right where they want us. And that's pretty much the end of my talking about DBD in this video. I mean, at least for now. It's in a great place and will continue to stay popular because, much like something along the lines of professional wrestling, it fills a niche but lucrative need in the market that nobody else can match. As controversial as it is to say, Dead by Daylight is a good game, and the folks at BHVR more or less deserve their flowers for creating it. But what about the other games they've made? Now, to be clear, when I talk about the other games BHVR has made, I'm not going to get too deep into their time as a small company that made cash grab games for larger studios. They were doing what they had to do to establish a foothold in the industry, and I will never blame them for that. Because they were just operating on the biddings of others though, I don't think it's really fair to criticize them for the Game Boy Advance movie tie-in games like Ice Age, High School Musical, or Chicken Little. Speaking of which, how cool would it be to have the dad from Chicken Little in Dead by Daylight? That dude was a monster and deserves to spend eternity on a meat hook. Anyway, the studio, which was going by Artificial Mind and Movement at the time, really started to find its way with two games I remember very vividly from my childhood: Wet and Naughty Bear. While it's been mostly forgotten today, WET was a big deal because it was A2M's first real opportunity to show the gaming world that they could handle an original intellectual property. This thing was published by freaking Bethesda at a time where that was a positive and not a negative. And really, it was a huge positive at that. Sadly, the game was pretty mid and there was never much demand for a sequel. It certainly wasn't terrible, or at least I don't remember it being too bad, but it really didn't do much to move the needle either. Not a strike per se, but not a home run either. All told, this was a decent base hit for a first outing in the world of original properties. The aforementioned Naughty Bear came out next in 2010, and this one is really funny to look back on. On the one hand, this is very clearly a predecessor to Dead by Daylight, and it's impossible not to notice the effects that this game had on Behavior's future smash hit. On the other hand, Naughty Bear was a janky mess with awkward controls and a gimmick that wasn't nearly as funny as the devs thought it was. I guess the jankiness could also be viewed as an omen of things to come too. Hilariously, people who pre-ordered Naughty Bear from GameStop, remember them, got special skins that turned the killer into Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees. So they were kind of the first licensed chapters if you think about it, even though they weren't actually licensed and the bear was just rocking some sick cosplay. In totality, Naughty Bear was fun for an hour or two, but quickly got stale, which seems to be the general sentiment other gamers had for it too. I played it, but even as a middle schooler, I just didn't really care to sink too much time into something that was so intentionally stupid. Still, the game resonated with some players and counts as another base hit in my book, if just barely. The studio would go back to being called BHVR Interactive in late 2010, and for the most part, they continued their process of pumping out licensed slop while squirreling away money for original projects. Again, I want to evaluate this company in good faith, so I just don't feel right about holding their feet to the fire over the fact that Rango the video game wasn't a generation-defining release. One project I do want to give them credit for, however, is their reunion with Bethesda, where they worked on Fallout Shelter. Honestly, this is one of my favorite phone games ever, and despite some of the money-hungry aspects of it, I think it turned out really well. No telling who did the heavy lifting since Bethesda and Behavior both developed this one, but as far as mobile games go, this was a really great outing for them. Fallout Shelter came out in 2015, and only a year later, Behavior released the game that freed them from having to make mindless cash grabs ever again. That's right, they dropped Love and Hip Hop, the game. They also released Dead by Daylight that year, and that was big too. Riding high after the success of DBD, Behavior would only wait 2 years to take another big swing on an original game, this time releasing Death Garden, or as I like to call it, DBD with guns. This game came out of the gate with tremendous promise. It had a polished look, a proven concept, and it was getting serious coverage from large DBD content creators like Monto at the time. Beyond that, it wasn't going to have to wait to add the proverbial big fish license like DBD had to do with Halloween, as Death Garden launched with a Terminator chapter already available for purchase. This sent the message that not only would Death Garden feature a similar approach to DLC as DBD, but that it would tackle licenses the slasher game really couldn't do as naturally, like RoboCop or maybe even something like Punisher. There's only one problem. The DBD formula works a lot better as a slasher game than as a shooter. As such, people quickly grew bored with the similar but worse product and went right back to Dead by Daylight. The game's launch had been a lot worse than expected, and a lot worse than DBD's, for what that's worth, and Behavior killed the servers less than a year into the game's existence. I guess you could say Death Garden walked so that Concord could run. Or fell so that Concord could fall much, much harder, I suppose. I hate to do it, but Death Garden has to be chalked up as a good and proper strike. Very bad look for Behavior, even if everyone understood what they were going for with that one. Licking their wounds, Behavior played their next entry way safer and chose to go with something in the DBD universe, attempting to capitalize on the fact that DBD fans are the most degenerate gooners this side of the Sonic fandom. In 2022, they released Hooked on You, a Dead by Daylight dating sim. At risk of coming off as an old stick in the mud, I'm going to say that this game was pretty horrendous. No, it was never trying to be high art, but as far as I see it, this game repeated the exact same mistake as Naughty Bear. It tried to sell itself on a gimmick that simply wasn't as funny as the developers thought it was. Hooked on You was a forgettable, mindless game that was never going to be great. It kneecapped itself with a bad gimmick and obnoxious, safe, horny dialogue that kept it from ever being interesting. It's hard to get too worked up about it since it was always something of a you-know-what post, but I'll call it a failure all the same since it tried to be funny and I think it missed the mark. I'm gonna call this one another strike. Also, I know some of you are likely yelling at me right now and saying that comedy is subjective, and I agree. It's just that in my subjective opinion, it wasn't a very funny game. In objective reality, if we want to go there, it never had a high player count on Steam either. There were literally more people who played a dating sim about Joseph Stalin, for reference, so I think it's fair to say it did not do super well. Following back-to-back underwhelming releases, one would hope that Behavior had something good up their sleeve for their next entry. And here's the thing, I actually really respect what they did next. Rather than rely on their DVD cash cow, which Death Garden did from a gameplay perspective, and Hooked on You did in pretty much every way imaginable, Behavior looked to left field and really offered something creative with their next release. That release came in the form of Meet Your Maker, a creativity-first base builder game where players could create deadly mazes for each other to try to survive. Again, this one had a lot going for it. Firstly, it was a cool, fresh idea. Secondly, it was heavily promoted within DBD itself and even got some cosmetics and a tie-in event. Perhaps most importantly of all, Ots Darva played it a good bit and released several videos on it. Given that Ots is DBD's Atlas in that he metaphorically holds their world in place and holds their sky above his shoulders, his stamp of approval was a massive victory. Even so, the game didn't really make much of a splash. After a month of being out, the game lost 84% of its player base and has hovered around 20 to 50 average players ever since. And believe me, this is not a grave I'm looking to dance on. In an industry dominated by companies that want to play it safe at all costs, Meet Your Maker was an inspired, interesting project. Despite this, I think a lot of people seem to have regarded it the same way I did. I respect Behavior's boldness, and I'm sure the game is good for what it is, but it's just ultimately not the type of game that I play, so I never bought it. Sadly, this too counts as a strike. That makes 3, and in the words of Joey Tribbiani, that means they only have 1 left. This is where it would be really cool to say that their next venture was some crazy, year-defining Baldur's Gate 3-esque epic, but sadly, that's not what we got. After the bold foray into the unknown that was Meet Your Maker, Behavior played it safe with their next release, a DBD spin-off venture known as What the Fog. This was a small project with minimal ambition, a short bit of fun sold to the tune of $5 a pop. Gameplay wise, I can't say much about it. I've watched some people play it and it looks fine enough for what it is. Cartoony, breezy, and ultimately inconsequential, What the Fog seems alright in the context of what it's offering. This was never going to be the next big thing for Behavior because it wasn't designed to be. It's a quick palate cleanser after a string of relative disappointments. There's not a whole lot to go off of in terms of critical reception for this one, but just under 200 people on Steam seem to like it well enough, and its one Metacritic review gave it an 80 out of 10, so not bad. Reading through the reviews, people seem to think that it was generally shallow and light on content, but that it accomplishes what it set out to do well enough. So yeah, it's hard to call this one a failure, but it also doesn't make sense to hold it up as evidence of Behavior's inherent talent for game design. One giant meh out of 10, it seems. All of that being said, Behavior quickly turned the tides with their next entry. If games like What the Fog and Hooked on You lacked in ambition, their next title certainly didn't. Working with Supermassive, the team behind everyone's favorite horror walking simulators like The Quarry, the Dark Pictures Anthology, and Until Dawn, the team put out The Casting of Frank Stone. This game plays just like any other Supermassive game, with photorealistic graphics, telltale-like choices, and dialogue that only kinda makes you want to smash your head against the keyboard. The twist here is that Frank Stone is set in the universe of Dead by Daylight and wears that proudly on its sleeve. Minor spoilers for the game here, but it features references to things like killer add-ons, weapons, cosmetics, and even a brief cameo by the original 4 survivors. It's also an absolute certainty that the titular Frank Stone will one day come to Dead by Daylight, which gives all the more incentive for players to at least give the game a try. But is the game itself actually any good? Not necessarily. It kind of depends on who you ask, but for me personally, it doesn't strike me as Supermassive's strongest outing. While Until Dawn and The Quarry were both undisputed hits, Frank Stone feels more closely aligned with something like Man of Medan. Light on content, frequently corny, but enjoyable enough if this is the type of game you enjoy. I was personally very excited when the game was announced, but now that it's come and gone, I can't help but feel a little disappointed in the final product. If the game was always going to lean so heavily on the success of Dead by Daylight, I really wish they would have just gone all the way with it. It would have been really cool to see a game centered around Trapper, Huntress, or some other original killer tormenting the likes of Kate, Jonah, and Yunjin. To me, this just ended up feeling like the CW's Gotham show, where they could reference certain characters like Joker, but not actually use them. Frank was fine enough as a monster, and I look forward to him joining the game, I really do. But given how short and underdeveloped this one was, it really ends up feeling like one big commercial for that future chapter, rather than a fully fledged and realized work of art. One important caveat is that Behavior didn't actually develop Frank Stone, but rather they just published it. Still, if we can praise Bethesda for Doom and criticize EA for a disaster like the launch of Battlefront 2, we can certainly hold Behavior's feet to the fire for this one, especially since their fingerprints are all over it. Ultimately, Frank Stone is a mediocre game that should have been great, which makes it hurt all the more. It's far from the worst game we've talked about today, but I'm still allowed to be disappointed that Behavior and Supermassive weren't able to perfect their formula nearly 10 years after Until Dawn showed everyone how to do a game like this. And finally, after all of these projects, good, bad, and painfully middle of the road, we come to Behavior's latest effort, Project T. Though I like to remain cautious about new games, I'll admit, I was excited for this one. I knew it wasn't going to be the next Left 4 Dead, or even likely to be much more than an improved version of Evil Dead the game, but I was still looking forward to hopping in and seeing what the game had to offer. Sadly, that will never happen now that Project T has been canceled before it could even get off the ground. No Trespassers, no Thrall, no game. This was a big blow to a lot of excited fans, and because it came on the back of Frank Stone's relative flop, the question of whether or not Behavior can make games well has become fairly prominent again. I mean, are they actually talented game developers, or did they stumble across a life-changing lucky break that they're still riding high on to this day? It's a fair question, especially given the amount of mistakes that they've made with the very golden goose that they need so badly. Dead by Daylight's balance has always been bad, its graphics are a tragedy, its spaghetti code is a well-beaten horse, and these days, it seems like something as simple as making appealing cosmetics has become too difficult for the team at Behavior. Surely they must be terrible at their jobs, right? Well, no, not really, or at least I don't think so. I will gladly admit that Behavior has roughly 1 billion things they could do better, but that actually doesn't make them bad at their jobs, as silly as that may sound. They could be much better at their jobs, obviously, but it's only fair to point out that a studio can be good at what they do without reaching the heights of FromSoft, Larian, or CD Projekt Red. With so many studios out there, it's only fair to say that there has to be a middle ground between the best and the worst. I feel like that middle ground is exactly where Behavior resides. Nobody will mistake them for titans of the industry, but again, that doesn't mean they should be ridiculed. Sometimes a team is just good enough to make the playoffs, even though they have no realistic shot of winning the Super Bowl. Sometimes a wrestler is good enough to be a solid mid-card champion, even if they will never main event WrestleMania. Sometimes a musical artist is just good enough to carve out a long, fulfilling career, even though they will never get the chance to headline a big tour or festival. To me, that's where Behavior is. They're not the cool kids of the gaming industry, but they had a 10 out of 10 idea, and they've successfully managed it for almost a decade now. Even that can be a contentious point with some people, as there are those who insist that DBD is only still around because of brand loyalty or sunk cost fallacy, but for me personally, I find those arguments unconvincing. Many games have tried to dethrone DBD, and some have gotten closer than others, but the indisputable fact remains that none of them have accomplished their goal. No matter how greatly they innovate and redesign the asymmetrical philosophy, one steady remains in that the battlefield across from Behavior is where would-be empires go to die. The other games have come up short because they didn't have the right stuff. Dead by Daylight has survived because it does. And I don't want to hear excuses for shortcomings. 99% of the time, they're meaningless, like a grown adult talking about their potential. I don't care what you might do in ideal circumstances. I care about what you've done in reality. And in reality, Behavior has made a highly successful, if deeply flawed game. Their competitors have not. And I don't say all of this to glaze Behavior, a company I have no loyalty to and that I've been very critical of in the past. I only bring this up to point out that if you think Behavior is incompetent, then what can be said about their competition? They've adapted and survived, and I find that admirable, even if I wish they would hammer out some of the issues that have plagued the game for years. In closing, I'd like to point out that we've reached a moment in time where roughly 10,000 games are released on Steam each year. Quite a few console exclusives drop each year too, especially for Sony and Nintendo. Out of those 10,000 plus, most will never have more than a handful of players, if any at all. Even fewer will ever crack 100 or 1,000 players. Beyond that, far fewer will display any true staying power and will fade within a year of release. Against this backdrop, the success of DBD is rather impressive. Like it or not, you can't praise Dead by Daylight without praising the people who created and maintain it. The reality is that most of Behavior's games have come and gone without much fanfare because that's par for the course with game development. Many games are released, but very few of them make any noise at all. Given more time, resources, and experience, Behavior may eventually rise to the level of larger studios that force the public to pay attention with every release. But realistically, they're not there yet. DBD is their ticket to relevancy, and it's only been a player for about 8 years now. Just think about how it took BioWare pumping out KOTOR, Mass Effect, and Dragon Age Origins before people were finally able to consider them one of the big boys in the industry. Building a legacy takes time, so I don't want to get caught up in the here and now so much that I unfairly compare Behavior to long-established giants. They'll likely never reach the top of the mountain, but they're certainly in a good spot for the time being. So to answer the titular question, no. I don't think Behavior is bad at making video games. I just think that A, they've got some real and noticeable shortcomings, and B, making successful video games is really, really, really hard. But that's my take on the situation. I would love to know what you think down below. Please give me your thoughts. Let me know if you think I'm being too generous, if I'm too harsh, I can't imagine. But I'm kind of interested to know because I know this is something that really divides the community. But either way, thank you so much for watching this video. If you've made it to this point, hey, you could subscribe. It wouldn't kill you, likely, I don't think. So please do. But either way, thank you for watching. Hope you have a lovely day wherever you are. And until the next one, I've been Das Food. Bye, friends.
I've been dreaming on in my head like I've seen it. A life worth living is a life with meaning. I'll do what I love till my heart stops beating. I'm feeding this demon. Got a taste, can't erase bitterness.